This is Politics with Avi, and I'm Avi. Welcome to today's lesson. Today's episode is about political thought in the era of absolutism in Russia. Absolutism as a system becomes possible when the state gains extremely broad independence from all social groups in society. The expansion of state independence in social terms was observed even before Peter, but Peter's social reforms played a decisive role. It was they who ended the long-standing schism among the upper stratum of society, turning the nobility into a single class, having obligations only to the emperor. Thanks to Peter's table of ranks, personal merit rather than nobility are put forward as a determining factor in career advancement, which on one hand provides an influx of fresh strength to the upper levels of the social ladder, and on the other hand, given the mandatory service of the nobility, it increases its dependence on the emperor. These goals in particular are served by the law of uniformity, which tears off a significant part of the nobility from the land and therefore literally forces it to public service. Thus, a new social group is formed, the bureaucracy, a layer completely dependent on state power. The sovereignty of the monarch was also strengthened in connection with the strengthening of the position of the commercial and entrepreneurial layer. Peter's active encouragement of entrepreneurial activity through preferential government orders and the provision of privileges to merchants, etc., strengthened his position in relation with the nobility and vice versa. At the same time, benefits and advantages constantly coexisted with coercion up to the forced application of benefits themselves. But if the benefits, at least to some extent, compensated for the damage from the use of violence against the upper classes, then the peasantry did not receive such compensation. The additional tax burden through the introduction of a poll tax, the growth of service duties, the addition of peasants to factories are clear evidence of the straightening of serfdom in the state's policy towards the peasantry. This was especially pronounced in industry, where reforms led to the formation of a new social stratum, the working people, who served the Petrovsky manufactories. State interests also lay at the basis of actively stimulating the development of trade, primarily foreign trade. The government's encouraging export policy, custom tariff of 1724, ensured a positive trade balance and consequently a very significant influx of money into the treasury. During the Northern War, it was possible not only to acquire new territories, but also to realize the old dream of the Russian Tsars, to gain access to the Baltic Sea. But it would be wrong to reduce the matter only to the usual strengthening of trade relations with foreign countries. The significance of this fact is much greater. Russia has come out of isolation in relation to the West and has begun an active reorientation towards it in its foreign and domestic policies, in its way of life and culture. Without raising the question of evaluating this new orientation here, it should be emphasized that it determined the further development of Russia for almost 2 centuries. As a second part, the era of enlightenment absolutism, second half of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th centuries. We can speak about the Petrine era. The Petrine era was the completion of the process of the formation of absolutism, but it also turned out to be its most complete expression. It was under Peter I that the unlimited power of the monarch reached its maximum limit. The subsequent period became a stage in development, albeit not explicit but still limiting the powers of emperors. This was precisely the meaning of those events that went down in history under the name of the era of palace coups. The coups of the 18th century were, in essence, a reflection of the claims of Russian society for participation in power. Thanks to the perseverance of the Guard Parliament in the second half of the 18th century, the political system was stabilized. New forms of relations between the monarchy and society were developed. There were not only written mutual obligations in the form of constitutional law, rather, the imperial authorities recognized the limits of her abilities, which she tried not to cross. Perhaps such monarchy could be defined as self limited. It was this need for self restraint that determined the success of the reign of Catherine II, 1762 until 1796, and on the contrary, the failure of Paul I, 1796, 1801, and finally, the inconsistency and um, yes, the inconsistency of the policies of Alexander I. The need to reckon with public opinion has become an integral feature of the state system and formed the basis of politics called enlightenment absolutism. Its main difference from traditional absolutism was the duality of the events. On one hand, governments actively opposed all attempts to change the existing system, but on the other hand, they were forced from time to time to make partial concessions to the demands of society. At the same time, there was not a single monarch who was consistent in his liberal aspirations. All of them, as a rule, entered the active struggle against liberalism, and in the second half of the reign. First of all, it was expressed in the strengthening of centralism in the public administration system, with the goal of putting society under tight control. Examples of this kind are, for example, the provincial reform of Catherine II or the creation of the Council of Ministers by Alexander I. The government did not refuse to use repressive methods in the fight against liberals. Amongst them can be called quite tough, like the arrest of N.I. Novikov or Link A.I. Radishev, and very moderate in the form of a traditional disgrace, such as, for example, M.M. Speransky. In contrast to the policy of attracting reformers of the beginning of the reign, very conservative figures such as A.A. Arakcheva can also be identified. No less dual character was the social policy of this era. If the expansion of the privileges of the nobility, most fully expressed in the Charter of the Nobility, 1785, and the organization of local noble self-governed looked, in general, naturally, then the patronizing policy towards the business community and the creation of city self-government, the Charter City, 1785, even more so attempts to resolve the peasant question, decrees on a 3-day corvée in free field cultivation, the abolition of serfdom in the Baltic states, etc., clearly indicate an understanding of the state's need, at least a partial change in the social system that needs to be required. However, the main direction in the social policy remained the desire to maintain existing relations unchanged. Therefore, it was the second half of the 18th century, the first quarter of the 19th century, that the feudal dependence takes on complete forms of slavery, turning the peasants into an absolutely powerless class. Captive tendencies are clearly visible in the practice of creating military settlements and the final elimination of Cossack autonomy. The consequence of this policy was an increase from the second half of the 18th century social conflicts. The Cossack Peasant War, led by E. Pugachev, played a particularly noticeable role in this regard. If such truly large-scale social actions of the previous centuries, the uprising led by S. Razin, which were often defined as a peasant war, as peasant wars in Soviet historical science, it was not in fact such, then the performance of the Pugachevs perhaps we can characterize precisely as a peasant war. For the reasons, the growth of serfdom and the government's offensive on the rights of the Cossacks, and the social composition of the participants, peasants, working people, the Cossack, national minorities, etc., and the goals, the struggle to eliminate serfdom, this speech was really peasant. Therefore, despite the defeat of the rebels, the significance of the uprising is extremely great. It was in that that it was discovered the strength of the discontent accumulated in the peasantry, which stimulated the future search for a solution to the peasant question and ultimately became the factor whose memory forced the Russian state to abolish serfdom in the next century. Less widespread, but no less significant, were many other social performances. The Chuguevsky uprising of military settlers, the uprising of the Semyonovsky regiment, etc. which revealed an ever increasing threat of social instability. Thus, the period of enlightenment, uh, about absolutism, sorry, is characterized by intervening um, interaction and mutual confrontation of the old and new in all spheres of life. Liberalism and despotism in politics, the expansion of the rights of some classes and the narrowing of others in the social sphere, the increase in the freedom of entrepreneurship, and the possibilities of business entities in the economy. The dual nature of Russia's development in this era is everywhere observed. Such inconsistency and lethargy of the authorities in creating promising political strategy, along with increasingly obvious depressive phenomena in all spheres of the country's life, became one of the first signs of the growing global crisis in Russia. As a matter of fact, it was precisely counteraction to crisis tendency in the development of Russian society that was the main task of the system of enlightened absolutism. Failure to propose an effective policy for overcoming the crisis from above has led to increased activity of society itself in the search for a means of resolving the crisis from below. It was this attempt to find a way out of the impasse worthy for Russia that became the well-known Decembrist movement. Decembrist movement. The movement was the result of the development of several highly controversial political processes in Russia. Firstly, the real contradiction of Russian society needed to be resolved. Secondly, a rather significant social stratum formed, claiming to participate in state activities. Thirdly, the patriotic war, on the one hand, completely showed the previously hidden opportunities of Russia, which clearly did not correspond to the existing social, economic, and political system. And on the other hand, it helped to see how it was possible to use them more effectively, as was done, for example, in Western Europe. This is what played a decisive role in the emergence and development of the Decembrist organizations. Um, the crisis of the absolutist system from the 20th to the 50s, 20s to 50s of the 19th century. In this part, we revised the failures. The failures of the Decembrists caused a sharp increase in conservative features in the politics of the Russian state. Already not inclined to the promotion of free thought, Nicholas I praised the December 14th uprising as the result of too liberal a policy of Alexander I. Therefore, in an effort to prevent new speeches, he considered the main task of the government to prevent the spread of liberalism in Russia. A supporter of the preservation and strengthening of the autocracy, Nicholas I believed that for Russia this was the only possible form of power without which it would perish. Naturally, no changes related to limiting the authority of the monarch could even be discussed. This direction of domestic policy became especially distinct after the revolution in France in 1830. The leading slogan since that time was the protection of the original Russian system, based on the well-known formula of the then Minister of Education, SS Uvarova: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. Theory of official nationalism. The main objective of all measures to strengthen the state apparatus was the desire to prevent the spread of liberal ideas in the country. The main barrier on their way was to become a police apparatus. So that he could cope with this mission, a number of measures were taken to reorganize this system. In particular, all cases of political crimes were transferred to the third department of the Imperial Chancellery, created in 1826. This institution, together with the Gendarmerie Corps, placed under strict control not only any social activity, but also the state of mind. It cannot be said, however, that the government did not at all notice the growing crisis. Throughout the entire period, it tried to find one way or another way to resolve the peasant question. In the 30s, 40s, About a dozen secret committees were set up to draft abolition of serfdom. Some of the proposals put forward by them were even implemented. So the sale of peasants without land was prohibited. The landlords lost the right to give their serfs to mining works. But the most significant milestone of this period was the reform of state peasants, carried out under the leadership of P.D. Kiseleva. According to the plan, it was to streamline the management of state peasants, for which a special Ministry of State Property was created with provincial and district administrations on the ground, with the assumption of some peasant self-government. However, in reality, the reform was reduced only to the transfer of peasants from the jurisdiction of some officials to the hands of others, which often not only did not improve, but on the contrary, complicated the situation of the peasant population. Thank you so much for being a part of today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. You'll hear more from me quite soon. Have a wonderful day.